Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ice Time. We dive in some big ideas around the NHL. I'm Mike Fink, and I'm joined again, actually, because we had him on early in the season, actually the first week of the season, to talk about expansion. We're kind of doing something similar. Ted Starkey is back. Ted Starkey covers the NHL at large, covers as an editor, writer, written a few books. It's hard to introduce Ted, so I always try and then always get confused about what route I should go. He also is at Hockey Hot Stove covering the Washington Capitals, so check out all his good work there. And Ted had you on last time to talk about expansion, so we like having you on for big ideas because you obviously know a lot about not just hockey but general stuff. So Ted, how's it going?
Good. Basically you could describe me as a utility infielder if you want to use the baseball term. I kind of if you need a shortstop, I'm available. So happy to be here. But yeah, no, it's good. Obviously the NHL's season's a month in, and as we were talking off air, it's there's some teams that you have no idea what they're going to do in the last couple months of the year because it's been kind of a crazy start to the season.
It really is one of those crazy starts to the season. I was thinking you mentioned that you're utility infielder. I'm trying to think of hockey positions, like which one you would maybe be like the Swiss Army knife or something. Third line center. I feel like I'm now thinking about all the people I have on. I have my usual, like I have some people that are reoccurring. It's like I have my e-bug. Let's just say that where it's like, oh,
Right.
I need someone for that week.
Or set a
You have
defenseman, a guy who can rotate in or
yeah, you have
rotate forward
your
either
backups and
way.
stuff. Uh, I feel like yeah, you're probably more of that third line center where it's like if I need to ask you to do anything, you can do that, and that's one of the things that brought you on because this topic it's kind of hard. It's one of those general NHL topics that we're going to talk about this week because the Global Series just happened, where you had the Predators and the Penguins. They went to Sweden. They played two games there, and you're starting. It's become an annual occurrence where you have the Global Series there, whether it's in Sweden or in Czechia or wherever it is. It's always like one place every year. I actually want to start by asking you this, which is what when did you find out that the global series is happening this week? Slash, like, was it when I reached out and said, "Oh, I want to talk about the global series," or at what point did you realize? Because this is something I want to ask because I feel like general fans were checking the schedule on Thursday or Friday, and they were like, "Huh, that's odd. Why is their team playing at 2 in the afternoon?" And then all of a sudden they're like, "Oh, wait, there's a global series this week." I feel that's what I think general fans were. But I'll ask you that, which is when did you kind of realize, oh yeah, the global series is happening this week, and it's the Predators, Penguins, and they're going to Sweden. Maybe you had it a little bit more, but I kind of want to ask you that to start.
Basically, the only reason I remembered is, seeing some tweets from some of the Pittsburgh writers just mentioning they're going overseas. A couple, obviously last year believe it was the Devils and Sabres started the season overseas, so it's a little bit more obvious because that was actually the beginning of the season. This is kind of, sandwich in the middle of a November schedule. It's a little less obvious, but yeah, I kind of saw that some of the writers said they were going overseas, and oh yeah, they're doing that over there this year. But it's interesting how they schedule these. I know, like you were saying, they try to rotate them through various countries, and obviously, it's geared towards certain players on certain teams. Obviously Nashville, they wanted Philip Forsberg to come in, and obviously the Penguins have Erik Karlsson, so it's you can kind of showcase some of the nation's big stars. But yeah, it's a little bit of a weird spot in the schedule, especially when you consider you kind of have to take two teams out of the schedule matrix for about a week and then, get everyone overseas and then they come back. It's not really a bye, but it's a really long road trip for two games.
No, really, that's the other part to this is that this time it happened in the middle of the season, and usually, or not usually, but in the past they've had it where they do it a week before. Let's say the season starts the first week of October, so like the last week of September they'll do it, and it is interesting because I feel like when I ask you that, and of course some of the beat writers were traveling, and they're like, "Oh, I'm going to Sweden, I'm flying," and they talk about their flights, which is always fun to see, like they were talking about the whether it's delays or crazy flight schedules, but stuff like that, which always happens. But it was one of those things that I feel like again, this is kind of speaks to the shortcomings of the NHL scheduling. It's not just this, but like the Frozen Frenzy, for example. When I wonder how many fans realized there was a Frozen Frenzy happening. And first of all, it happened like in October when, most sports fans have a few things that they're interested in instead of hockey in early season October. And I kind of want to ask, like, how should the NHL market? Is it playing the game early in the season? But the question is, what time is a good time to do this? Is it that first week of the season, or do you want it to be in February, let's say when the All-Star break is, or they don't want it late in the season, obviously, where the trade deadline and all that stuff's going on. They don't want any issues there in the late season push. But when is the sweet spot slash how does the NHL market this? Because I feel like right now they're struggling to tap into something that's really big or really could be big. We look at the way the NFL has marketed the global games that they do, and they're not doing it yet, and they can do it. So I'll just ask you, what should they be doing with all that in mind?
I mean, if you do this, it's probably the sweet spots we had in the preseason, beginning of regular season last year. I know, Buffalo left. It was funny, like, half their preseason games are just guys from Rochester, playing NHL teams or whatever they were icing against them. But, there's more time to do this. I think it's disruptive for teams because obviously you're basically out of pocket for a week. You have to take all the equipment overseas, which is, all those equipment guys already do a tremendous job as it is, but to have to take it all through customs and stuff like that, that's a whole other ball of wax. I can't remember. I think historically it's usually been October and November. I think once, like you were saying, later in the season, I think you get into more, teams really don't want that kind of distraction later. I mean, part of it is I'm sure teams on one hand appreciate the break in a monotonous schedule. The other hand, it's just, it's a long time away. I mean, I remember, teams have been going overseas for decades. I remember a long time ago, the Capitals went to the Soviet Union. And I just remember like the players kind of complained that they were spending so much time overseas. They were grateful for the trip, but the team started off very poorly because this was during training camp and a lot of them, it was just an exhausting trip. And so, but if you're going to do it, I mean, I think probably the end of preseason is probably good because you can play a couple games against local teams, which teams have done in the past, and then you can play your two regular season games, kind of kick off the season with some attention. But yeah, I mean, I can't imagine too many people were paying attention outside of Nashville and Pittsburgh for these two games.
No, yeah, and that's the part of this, which is that that's the other part where you're not creating this optimal game where everyone can watch it. I think in Sweden or wherever they play it, fans are paying attention to that game, and especially when, let's say, Finland hosts a game and it's the Florida Panthers versus the Dallas Stars, where it's not just like the best Finnish players, but the Finnish icons that are in the league. Or whenever back in the day, like if the Rangers played the Red Wings and it was Nicholas Lidstrom and Henrik Lundqvist in Sweden, that yeah, like you get the point that those games are popular there, but they're not. You're not really bringing a global audience that for fans in general because they're watching. It's just kind of first of all it's all mixed in with the other games, and the other part which is all obviously the timing, which is a 9 a.m. start time. Sunday was 9 a.m., which on Sunday happened to be the same time that there was a football game in Spain. So you're already losing people there. But on Friday at 12, I think most people are working then. So the timing already you're stacked against there. I wonder the time's off for the NHL. And this is why I'm wondering why not? I know the players like that time off, but you have, let's say, Christmas break, which you have December 20 through 25, or 20 through 27. You have like 5 days there. And obviously players love that and they don't want to take off for that. And the NHL is the last league that doesn't have games on Christmas. It's like the one league that doesn't do it. Every other league is like I mean baseball excluding baseball, but the other leagues are like that's our prime time. We're gonna have games on that day, and the NHL doesn't. And the other time is the All Star break, where you have that week off. And I know the future of the All Star break is kind of in question for good reasons because the Four Nations actually was better to watch than the All Star break. Let's just be honest about that. So, but I wonder why not those periods? I know the players probably would not be happy about that, but if you really want to grow this or make it a big thing, why not then?
I think, well, for years, the NHL used to play on the 23rd and the 26th. And I think what happened is, I remember distinctively a couple of years before they kind of basically now it's in the CBA, you can't play on those days. But players would complain because the rules changed a couple of years ago because of weather. Basically, a team has to be in town during the regular season the night before. So obviously, if you're playing on the 26th, that meant teams had to travel on Christmas. And so a lot of players, I think, got really upset about that. That was on one of the few concessions that they got, in negotiations with the NHL. But so now there's this blackout period. So teams basically have to be off around Christmas because the players really hated it. The employees hated it. And, honestly, with the for a while, it was the NBA was the one team that played on Christmas. And then the NFL's kind of, figured out, hey, we can get good ratings doing this too.
Yeah.
But I think the NHL they basically figured, they've tried to take over New Year's Day, which has obviously been problematic with the college football playoff expanding. They're trying to take over some of these February days where they have stadium series, but it's kind of tough because there's a couple days they've targeted to be niches on the calendar, and that Black Friday's another one they tried to take over. So it's they're looking for their niche, but it's tricky. Just they kind of get pushed out by other sports.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting because you're talking about the schedule, and obviously, like, yeah, the NHL doesn't want to really trek into that, and the players don't want to go into their times off. Like, do not mess with that. It's interesting because the interesting part is their niche time or their sweet spot is that February sweet spot. It is interesting because when the Super Bowl ends, I mean, it's why the Four Nations was a perfect collision or perfect storm. It was the Super Bowl is out of the way. The NBA is having their I don't know, skills practice contest, whatever they do. They just do warm ups then. They don't really try at all. And the NHL had US Canada, everyone was watching that perfect storm there. And it's interesting this year again, you have the Olympics, and it feels like a good time to have the global series, let's say, is put a team right after the Olympics in that Olympic city, and presumably they'll have a rink, although the news about that is unclear. But they'll have a rink there for you to play a game right after the Olympics, and you could actually just build off of that. You could have an NHL game. That's their sweet spot. I mean, the problem, of course, is with February is that it leads right into the trade deadline. I think that's the other issue. Not just the global series, but I think what's interesting and why I wanted you here is because I a part of me is that I guess you call it spider senses or just this. So you start noticing these things when you see the news and you're like, okay, what does that mean? What is the NHL doing here? And the big news was something probably when I noticed is that they opened up offices in Zurich in Switzerland, and which is a little interesting. First of all, there of all places, although I think it's a nice city, so good for them. But they're opening in Europe an office there, and I wonder what that means for the NHL, whether it's they're looking at expanding there or what they're trying to accomplish there. So I mean, the broad question I'll ask you is what do you think the end game is? You're opening an office there. It's clearly a vested interest in growing the game in Europe, which is pretty obvious they want to do that. But what's the end game for the NHL by doing that?
I think there's a couple reasons. I think you're going to see them try to expand the overseas games. We were talking off about how the NFL has really gone. I think they had 6 or 7 overseas games this year, maybe more. So I think
Yeah.
you may see. I think a couple times in the past they've sent 4 teams over. Uh, either playing in 2 separate cities or kind of doing a round robin. You'll probably see more of that. You'll probably also see the NHL kind of try to be a little bit more. One of the reasons with Switzerland, I think you have the IOC there. I think there's a little bit more lobbying. At times the International Ice Hockey Federation and the NHL have not really seen eye to eye, and it may be more, especially in Switzerland, to have a presence there because obviously it's close to the international hockey community. So the NHL probably wants to, uh, have just basically be available more than Zoom or having to have someone fly over. And the other reason, eventually they probably will look at putting teams in Europe. I think it's going to be, I mean, well off in the distance because, clearly they're going to put a couple more teams in the United States. And really, if you expand to Europe, you have to have like at least 4 teams at once because you can kind of create a schedule that's imbalanced, but It's easier for the NFL to travel to Europe because it's one game, you get one team to come over. NHL, you'd really have to have a team do a road trip through a couple teams and play like 2 or 3 weeks in Europe. So, uh, but I think a lot of it in Switzerland is probably more for to kind of be on par with the IIHF and kind of put its place there because they have had disagreements more so than in recent years. I think obviously with the Four Nations was held under NHL rules. The Olympics are going to be under IOC rules, but the NHL isn't thrilled with all the IOC rules, so I think they want tournaments on their own term and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a big thing also is that, yeah, the Olympics are going to be under those IOC rules, and the NHL wants them to be, I mean, more so NHL. That's, again, like the Four Nations. You look at those type of events that they would have, they are under NHL rules. It's interesting you mentioned that the NHL would look at expanding because when I had you on, we are talking about expansion, and they're going to look to first expand in the United States, let's say, to get to 34. But it's interesting because yeah, I do wonder about expansion into Europe. Can it realistically work? And I think at first you're saying no, it's impossible. Players travel just to get everyone there, and the players, a lot of players maybe would say, "Oh, I don't want to play in." If they were, let's say, an expansion draft, and you told the player, "Oh yeah, you can, you just got drafted by." We'll make up a team, but in Finland, let's say, I don't know, or Germany, wherever it is, uh, and they're like, "Nah, I'm going to retire instead. I'm not going. I'm not moving there. I'm not going there." Uh, but I think what's interesting about that is that I think there is a path to expansion where you look at historically, you look at the NHL when it first expanded, which is that they moved teams out to California. Back then, travel was a lot harder. So what did they do? They had
Right.
if you had the Kings and the Sharks out west, a team that was traveling there would play 3 games, or they'd play back to back in San Jose, then they'd play back to back in LA. And then similarly, the LA teams would come over and play like a whole road trip. So in terms of like what how it can happen, you could see a path there where there are, let's say, four cities in Europe, and then they play those teams. One of the things I was wondering about that, though, with the offices there, is does the NHL want to kind of get an umbrella or get a monopoly over the European leagues there? Because I think one of the reasons I ask is because you look at, let's say, the AHL, or you look at some of the leagues here where players are leaving them because, I mean, to be frank, the money is not there, and they need to go to Europe to really make it worthwhile if they're not going to make it to the NHL. Does the NHL? Do you think the NHL would want to get a monopoly or get a grasp on those type of leagues?
I mean, I think the interesting part is like with the geopolitical climate, I think one of the natural ways you could see an international club hockey advance is like say if the KHL or its predecessor would see kind of a super series. Obviously, back in the 80s and 90s, you saw Russian teams come over, tour the NHL, and a couple of the NHL teams went over to the Soviet Union. But obviously now that's really not you can't have uh, you know, a team from the KHL come to the NHL and play in like a Super Series or Challenge Cup, which has been done in the past. And obviously those leagues have been kind of at odds at times. There have been players who have tried to sign with a KHL or an NHL contract, and the NHL kind of went and said you can't do that, and vice versa. There's all sorts of negotiations when guys in the KHL want to come over. So they don't really see an eye to eye, but that would be the natural spot. And you talk about the various leagues. Obviously, the NHL is a premier league in the world. The KHL and the AHL is kind of a younger number two version of the league. The KHL is older, but I think in terms of quality hockey, I think the AHL is still slightly better because I think there's a little bit more structure to it. The KHL is kind of like retirement hockey. And then, you have the German league, the Swedish league, the Finnish league. They're kind of all like just under the KHL. But, you know, for a while you had the Russian teams were pretty much if not talent wise, close. Competitively wise, they were close. I don't think you have that anymore, which obviously creates issues because you don't want to have a team, NHL team, going to a KHL team that isn't up to par and winning like 6-0. And I know in the past, teams have had issues with cheap shots too. Like the Russians get frustrated, they'll take a slash out. I think it was the Carolina Hurricanes lost a player for a while after a trip overseas. And I think that's kind of where the KHL trip stopped because they were seeing, a lot of cheap shots going on. So they kind of said, we're not going to do this anymore. So, but if the NHL expands over there, I think they would pick a couple markets. Obviously, you'd really have to have an unbalanced schedule, kind of like the old AHL. The California teams pretty much play mostly
Yeah.
each other, and then the rest of the league plays each other because obviously you couldn't have a balanced 84 game schedule with teams from Europe, but you'd have to try to figure out a way to make it work. But like I said, I think that's going to be a long time off because I think the NHL knows they can get a lot of money expanding in the United States, and the whole the whole structure of building arenas and stadiums and getting public funding is much different in the United States and even Canada and Europe in particular. That you look at some of the sports facilities for soccer, even though it's a premier sport over there, you don't have the money poured into it, say, as you would an NHL arena in an American city. So I think there would probably have to be a change in that venue too, because obviously they want to make money, and that's the big thing over there.
Well, yeah, that's the interesting thing you said about the arenas. That's that. Yeah, I feel like you kind of your best path with that in mind is you say like the San Jose Sharks owner. I think he has a big, strong foothold in Germany and has built a few arenas there. So it would be someone like him or someone who had the money to build put a team there would try to. I guess similar to a lesser degree with Ryan Smith in Utah was like, I want to put a team there, I'm willing to put all the money in to make it happen, and then they make it happen because of that. So I think if you have those teams there, it is interesting you mentioned that. It's not I didn't forget as much as like I didn't figure out how to tie it in the Russian part of this whole thing, which is not only a thorn in the side for the NHL when it comes to the global series and the global market, but just in general international play. I mean, you talk about the Olympics, which is a thing, but I mean, yeah, there's this part of the NHL that it's like it just burns at them that they can't have like a Penguins Capitals game in Moscow or St. Petersburg with like Ovechkin, Malkin, or even if you let's say it was not Malkin and the Penguins, but let's say you do Capitals versus Lightning, and you have Kucherov and you have not Sergachev, you have Andrei Vasilevsky, you have these players that it's a thorn in their side, and I mean, it does delay, and that's another part that it does delay things there as well, and I mean, yeah, it is interesting because it's like it's that extra thorn in the side. But I mean, yeah, one of the things though, you look at those leagues that they are lesser leagues, even the KHL or those Swedish leagues,
Yep.
and I I wouldn't say that the AHL would expand because I don't think that's what's happening. What I would say though, or what I wonder about is, do you think it's possible that let's say NHL teams will have their their Swedish team or their German team, and they have those teams as well? I guess it would be similar to well, not baseball these days, but it used to be baseball back in the day. I mean, Branch Rickey formed the Cardinals farm system based on like, I have minor league teams everywhere. And because I own these minor league teams, I have all the prospects. And that's actually a little baseball history there on a hockey podcast, go figure. But do you think that that's something that can you maybe be possible where teams in the NHL will not necessarily buy them, but each team can get like a few European teams and they can have control over the prospects they draft, let's say, whether it whoever it is, but those players that they can bring them up through Sweden, but that's their team now. So it's another sort of thing. Do you think that's something that first of all the NHL would want, and second that is possible or something that makes sense?
I think they would want that. I mean, obviously the downfall of the Soviet Union, they had the Russian Penguins for a while, which obviously the Penguins owned, but eventually, the KHL basically wanted control over its own product. And I think the problem is too, like a lot of these other leagues don't necessarily trust the NHL because obviously they're the big dog on the block. And I think S they're pretty, they're friendly with the SEL in Sweden. I think obviously players go back and forth there relatively freely. Obviously, like I was saying, with the geopolitics, you were mentioning about the capitals possibly going to Russia. They actually had plans in place before the invasion of Ukraine to put teams over there, and then obviously became untenable. I think it was 2023 was going to be the projected time they're going to go over there, play a couple regular season games, and that's never going to happen now because obviously Ovechkin will be by the time it's all settled and Russia's welcome back in the fold. Ovechkin will be skating over there at some point. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a point where I think the leagues there want to defend themselves too. I think there is a little bit of a feeling that, obviously the NHL is the dominant. It's not like the NFL and the NBA, it's a little easier because, the NFL is the dominant football product in the world. The NBA is the dominant foot or basketball product in the world. Baseball obviously has Japan and Korea have leagues, but they're not, Japan's probably as closer than anything in the hockey equivalent. But, I think the Russian league would probably be the closest to the NHL, and right now they have difficulty doing business. So it's kind of tricky. And the SCL and the German league are slightly below that. I mean, they're competitive, but they're not. You put an NHL team against a German league team, it's not going to be a really competitive contest.
Yeah, I think that's the extra layer to it is that yeah, you have that tension, and now it's like yeah, it is that thorn in the side, and also I think that's what's interesting is about opening these offices is that you can see the NHL wants to bridge the gap or wants to I think do that with the possibility they want to have those good relationships again because like they aren't for a while and they haven't been for a while in the sense like the NHL also has viewed Europe as like an enemy or this area that they didn't want players to know about. It's well documented that during the lockout in 94, 95 or 90, 94, 93, anyway, during the lockout, players went overseas and the league hated that because
Yep.
the bottom line is that players saw, by the way, the grass could be greener on the other side. I mean, especially if you're an NHLer who isn't making it and you're not, and you're reaching, especially it happens all the time in the AHL, which is why it's a big problem the AHL is dealing with, which is you're 26, 27, you're not making to the NHL, and a team in Germany or Switzerland is willing to pay you a ton of money to go over. You can do that for a few years, and the grass is greener on the other side. So for years, there has been that tension for both sides. And I think now it's possible that the NHL is looking into trying to bridge that gap and trying to work that out. We're running a little low on time, so I actually wanted to wrap up. I wasn't just going to talk about the Global Series, but I wanted to wrap up with it's actually NHL. It's not big hockey news. Big news for us as we actually cover the NHL and write about it is that a longtime columnist for the New York Post, Larry Brooks, passed away on Thursday, and there's been a lot of great there's been a lot of articles written and a lot of tributes to Larry Brooks, who's I mean controversial as it gets in terms of a columnist, but no one's going to deny that first of all they read him and respected him, and he was. I mean, there's no other way to put it than he was a titan in the industry, and. You wrote a great piece on it. You wrote about the way he covered hockey, which I think is something I'm fascinated by. I liked it because you see a lot of people in the mainstream media these days that are basically PR members extended, where they don't write critically or honestly about the team. And Larry Brooks was part of mainstream media, but had no problem writing what needed to be written. And you're seeing a lot of what he did in independent media, but independent media doesn't have the inside information or doesn't have the access or doesn't have the same respect, let's say. So he bridged that gap. But I mean, I didn't meet him. I actually have never met him, but I mean, obviously I read Slapshots. It's one of the things that inspired like the column that I write every Monday. But if you have any stories or any thoughts, just on Larry Brooks, someone who's no other way to put it is a titan in this industry. Feel free to share them.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wrote that he's basically, he was such a landmark guy. He always wrote the Sunday column, between Jay Greenberg with the Philadelphia Inquirer, Kevin Paul DuPont with the Boston Globe. There were must readings on Sundays because, they would just compile information. And, the way the industry has changed so much. I mean, I talked with some of the veteran writers from, bygone eras, and, they would regularly give players rides to the airport. They would take them out to eat, because the players would want to save the per diem. So they would, hey, I'll tell you some stuff if you take me out for food. And so, it was a different era, and he was really well connected. I think, that was one of his strengths. He always knew what the Rangers were doing before anyone else knew it because, he would be very tight with the Rangers management. So, when they wanted to make a trade, when they wanted to do something, they would, hey, Larry, we're thinking about doing this, write about it, see what people think. But I knew him in passing. I wasn't, I don't want to say, I knew him well. I think my favorite memory of him was one time I covered a Capitals Rangers playoff series, and it was when John Tortorella was coaching the Rangers, and he had about a 30-second press conference. And, Larry came in after Torts had left and had some choice words, but, obviously you know, it was, more frustrated, but, he covered, he was a PR guy. He worked for the New Jersey Devils for a decade. He obviously did his with the Post for a long time, and, he knew his stuff. Like, it was interesting. I was reading some of the remembrances of him, and he would recommend reading the CBA of the NHL is a good way to figure out what the league, because then you can kind of figure out what the league's trying to do. And, that's a smart thing to do, because you kind of see where the money goes and, what they want to do and what they want to accomplish. But, he was a very smart guy. He knew the game. He loved the game. And, obviously hockey writing will be poor for not having him around.
Oh yeah, like the NHL, it feels like a part of, you talk about the newspaper world that he was a part of, and it feels like a part of that world died with him, where it's like that idea of like the columnist who traveled with the team. And first of all, that doesn't even happen as much anymore, but like that newspaper, like must read newspaper, it's different because now everything's online. So it's like you kind of, there are some people online that it's like you have to read them online, but there isn't that same sort
Right.
of weight with them. And he had that. It's interesting that you mentioned, one of the things that was interesting, there was a tribute. Molly Walker wrote a great piece after his passing, and she got to know him well. And this is one thing I guess I'd wrap up on my end with, is that Larry Brooks had no problem mentoring the younger writers. Molly Walker was a younger writer, still is by hockey standards, and that he didn't see them as competition. Oh, I'm gonna have to ignore them. And you see a lot of that sometimes in the hockey world, where some veteran writers
Right.
get known as grumps or whatever because they're like, oh, this is competition, or I'm gonna ignore that person. I don't take them seriously. But he took Molly under his wing and really mentored her, and she's a rising star in the industry because of him, and he had no issue doing that. And it's interesting because like for me, I'm young. I'm one of the younger ones. Also, I mean, below the age of 30, which I guess in hockey is also young. So for both worlds, but it's interesting. I'm like part of Hot Stove now is that I'm surrounded by some of the people who've been around for a while, and you don't take that for granted when you're a part of that, because you have people. I mean, Ted, you're part of this site, and appreciate you
Right.
there.
Yep. No
And
problem.
yeah, there's a bunch of people there that have been around for a while, and someone who's younger like myself, you don't take that for granted. I don't take that for granted, and it's real. So like, it's great to see like Larry is able to bridge that gap, and you see it's great to see around hockey that there are people willing to bridge that gap or connect the chain, or basically pass it on to the next generation. It's really great to see. You see it with players, and you see it with Larry too. Um, so I guess that's all I got, Ted. I know we're ending on a little bit of a sad note, but thank you again for making time out of your busy day to join. Really appreciate it.
Anytime. I'm glad to be on.
Yeah, it was a pleasure talking to you, and that is all we got. We hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, share, subscribe. Check out all the great work at Hockey Hot Stove. Make sure to buy one of Ted's two books. He wrote one on the AHL, and he wrote one on the Capitals. I think it's called Rising. Was it called Rising Dream?
Red,
What
Red Rising and Chasing the Dream.
Red Rising, and then there's Chasing the Dream, which is actually behind me over there. I should have remembered that off the top of my head, but check out that. Check out all the work at Hockey Hot Stove as well, and tune in next time for another great episode. Thank you.